Hi, I'm Anthony from Cindy Backyard Veggies. Today it's all about my tomatoes. I'm going to be doing a lot of work on my 3 different plantings. They're all at different stages of their growth and I need a little bit of extra care at this stage to really get them going. I'm over at my first planting of tomatoes here and I staked these in my last video. And it's been about 6 days since these were staked and they do need a second pruning, but also I'll be adding fertilizer and hilling the soil around these plants, and I'll come through and show you how I do that. This is my first planted tomatoes and the variety is called Thunder, and in my previous video I had pruned, given them an initial prune and staking, and as you can see a lot of those lower leaves just here and the side shoots have been removed, and I'd staked the plants tying the leaves to the posts on both ends, and that's been enough to support them. Now the plants are growing quite fast and I do need a second prune, but I also am at this stage where I want to add the first round of fertilizer and actually hill the soil around the stem of the plant. But before I do that, I'm just going to come and prune a few more of these leaves and retrain the tomatoes onto these stakes. Coming over to my first tomato, and as you can see, there's my cluster of flowers just over here. This is my second leader that I'm growing, and that's the main leader up there. Now the plants have grown quite a fair bit, so what I'll be doing is I'll be raising this string, this cord, and I'll be now, instead of using that to support the tomato, I'll be tying this leaf here to support the tomato instead. And I'll be removing that lower leaf. The idea was these leaves are quite close to the ground and they will be vectors for disease, and I don't want to allow for that to happen. This leaf, I will be tying this leaf here. So again, I'll be removing this leaf as well. Just remove that leaf. There you have it. That's great. Now it's starting to grow a few. I'm really keen to grow this side shoot out a little bit more. My flower clusters are just starting to open, so it's looking really good. I have a few people ask me when I'm pruning my tomatoes, do I remove the first cluster of flowers for my tomato plants? In my context, I don't remove the first flower cluster. I don't find it adds any value. Some people say it actually helps the plant focus on growing size. I personally don't see any evidence of that. I personally would rather the tomatoes produce their fruit rather than have them taken off to concentrate on growing more leaves and plants. So I tend to leave mine alone, and I do find personally that the tomatoes at the first cluster are usually the best tomatoes that you end up growing. So it is actually an added bonus as to why you should keep them. Now, in adding my fertilizer, I'm a big believer in using low nitrogen fertilizers for tomatoes. They do like a bit of nitrogen at the start to get them to grow, but once they start flowering, I would like to switch to a low nitrogen solution. I find if you add too much nitrogen, they become a big bush and you spend the whole time pruning. For my low nitrogen, I like to use chicken manure pellets. Again, this is standard going. I use these throughout my garden. I buy it in 25 kilo bags and I'll just use it all the time. It's perfect. Although they like a low nitrogen fertilizer, they do like a lot of potash. So potassium, I add a decent handful in each of these plants. So in fertilizing tomatoes, I come across and with my little bit of chicken manure pellets, just like that, and then I'll add just a small bit of potash, and that's plenty. And this, now the tomatoes will be fine for about 6 to 8 weeks. When the big flush of flowers does come through, I will add a second round of potash, and it really helps them to thrive. The next thing I need to do now is to hill the soil around the tomatoes, and what I'll be doing is moving the soil from the right hand side and left hand side and bringing it up hard up against the stem. and really packing it in. And there's two reasons why I do that. One, it supports the tomato, which is what you want, especially in these strong winds, but also encourages root growth along the stem, which makes for a really strong plant, really thriving tomato. And I find that's the secret to really good tomatoes, is to make sure you maximize the amount of root growth along that stem. Now, you could also achieve that by planting it really deeply, planting it horizontally on the ground, and then covering it with soil. But my technique is to actually hill that soil around the plants. And then what you end up having is, in those areas where the high points, you will then have potentially a watering trough that you could, or watering trench that you could use to water. In my case, I'll be using irrigation. But if you don't have the irrigation, you will then water on either side of those tomatoes plants. So in hilling those tomatoes, using my hoe, just progressively bringing that soil up against the stem. And coming from the other end. And to now show you what I've done, you can see I've just put that soil in quite deep, and you can just see it just sitting there right up, hard up against the stem. That's exactly what I'm trying to look for. And on the sides, you can just see those trenches are starting to form, and I'll come through and form those trenches up a bit more defined, so that if I do decide to water using them, I'll be able to do that. Just finished hilling those tomatoes, and you can see I've got these trenches that are low points on the outside of the plants. And now you can use these as watering trenches, or in the case for me, I'll be using them if we have any major rain events. The rains will, drain down to this point, not impacting on the tomatoes. As you can see as well, the tomatoes are really quite deeply buried now. They're looking sturdier, and they're looking really, really good. I'm really happy how this has turned out. I probably won't hill them again. That's it for now. As they get bigger, it will just be too difficult to run the hoe in between the plants. But I will continue pruning and staking. And before I finish up on these tomatoes, I want to give them a bit of a spray. And I'll go through the sprays that I use, but at this stage now, we're just in the middle of the day. It's kind of a bit warm, too warm to spray. So late this afternoon, I'll show you what I will be spraying these tomatoes with. Now that we've moved into late spring and my tomatoes start flowering, I like to start my spraying regime. Now in my context, I'm happy to spray my garden, and I look for low toxic contact sprays to spray. I like to control caterpillars, especially the cabbage moth caterpillar varieties, but there's a number of different caterpillars that come through. One thing I like to suffer with, especially later in the season, is spider mites. The damage from spider mites. Spider mites are small spiders, and actually they suck the chlorophyll out of the plants, and it gives the tomato essentially a bronze color, and that's because of all the chlorophyll being sucked out. It actually removes the greenness out of the plants. When it comes to diseases, in my patch, I need to control, the two main diseases I need to control is bacterial spots, but also blight. I do have to control blight as the season goes on. To control pests like caterpillars and thrips and the like, I use pyrethrum, and I generally give the plants, especially when they're starting to fruit, a spray at least every 10 days to control spider mites and to control any of the bacterial diseases. I like to use wettable sulfur. Ideally, you want to use it as a preventative rather than a cure. I will spray my tomatoes fortnightly. Spider mites become a real issue as we move into the more humid parts of the season. The key with wettable sulfur is if the temperature in your area is going to be above 30 degrees, I would really hold off spraying. Try to spray on a cooler day. Also, if you're using any white oils or homemade white oils or store-bought white oils, do not spray wettable sulfur. White oil and wettable sulfur do not mix, they will burn your plants. I will mix this, I think it's 1 spoon per 2 liters of water with some pyrethrum, and I will apply the spray to it. And I like to do it in late afternoon when it's still quite cool. You give them a spray. Just coming over to my cherry tomatoes that I planted out about 4 days ago now. These were planted out on the weekend. And when I planted these tomatoes out, they had been in their punnets for about a week too long, so they weren't the best tomatoes. What I'm seeing now, I've been monitoring them over the last few days, and the plants have been getting yellow. They're starting to yellow a lot more, and which is a sign of lack of nutrients, especially nitrogen coming up into the plants. What I'm going to do here is actually just do a bit of a remedy to try to spruce them back up, but I will show you what they look like at the moment. And as you can see, it's just an overall yellowing of the tomato. Some of them look a bit better than others. This guy did green up a bit yesterday, but you got, yeah, just a bit of vigor, lost a bit of vigor. And the like, if you continue on, this one here as well, it's not looking the best. Now these tomatoes need a number of things to get them to green up again. First of all, they need nitrogen fertilizer. Now I've added liquid feed to these yesterday, and it just started to color up, but I find when your tomatoes are struggling like this, they also need a bit of magnesium, is what I find in my experience really helps them out. In my experience, adding a little bit of magnesium in the form of Epsom salts really helps these plants to absorb that nitrogen fertilizer and to green up. I find especially with tomatoes, where my tomatoes are struggling in that first transplant shock stage, adding Epsom salt really helps. In applying Epsom salt, I'm just going to get a handful of the salt. Now you're going to make sure that the Epsom salt you use isn't a scented variety, just standard salt, and just put it around the plant. And then with what I'll do is with my watering can, just dissolve those salts around the plant, and that should help it absorb that in. And I find that it does work fairly quickly, so hoping this will be enough to really get some color back into that plant. So we're going to go and just apply some salts to the rest of the tomatoes now as well. So I've added the Epsom salt to all the tomatoes, and I'm hoping that they will see some changes to these tomatoes over the next few days, and I'll come back and show you what the how they look in about a week's time. It's been 7 days since I applied the Epsom salt to the tomatoes, and I wanted to show you how much of a difference it does make. And if you can just see, the plants are looking much greener. You still got the little damage from the leaves earlier on, but generally speaking the leaves look really good. I have just applied a spray of wettable sulfur on these tomatoes as part of my spraying regime, but generally speaking they look amazing. They're actually starting to flower too, which is great. These do need to be staked. I did lose one just over here. It's sort of not recovering, but generally speaking the rest of the tomatoes have. And so when you find that your tomatoes are a bit yellowing at that start when you first transplant them, give them a good handful of Epsom salt, and then follow it up the next few days after with a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer, liquid feed, like power feed or something like that, to really get them going, and you should see the differences in the plants. Thank you everyone for joining me in this video. I really appreciate all the support, and I hope to see you in the next one.